Oh, it's about to start. Two, one. Oh, okay, cool. So it's my turn. All right, hey. Sorry, my brother's in here laughing at my inability to introduce things. So today we're talking about whether or not homeschooling should be illegal. It should be, and there's a myriad of reasons why it should be. But one of the main ones I kind of want to introduce with is I have over the past over the past 10 or so years, worked with children a lot in youth ministry and volunteering, and we have found a lot of cases over that time of children being abused in the home. And the way that we found those things was because adult eyes, other adult eyes outside of the home, were able to see those things and recognize them and put a stop to them. I think there is a problem intrinsically with the idea that a parent could theoretically keep their child in the home and away from external eyes. I think that your child should have the ability to be seen by wider society so that we know whether you're doing something, wrong. Yeah, and I have other arguments too, but I don't know what my opponent's going to say, so I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic and see where this goes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that opening. Hope we hear each other and we're all doing quite well. And I'm looking forward to this call-out debate. I'm sure it will be a fiery, interesting and entertaining and educational one. So actually, I want to start with educational. Speaking of educational, we are talking about whether or not homeschooling should be illegal. I would argue that homeschooling should not be illegal, but in order to do that correctly, we must show what exactly is homeschooling. So very quickly, to homeschool is to educate one's child at home and sending them to a school, and to educate is to give intellectual, moral, and social instruction. So what counts as education? Is it when the father, who's a car mechanic, teaches their children how to change a tire? Is it when the mother, who is a dancer, teaches her daughter ballet? Is it when they teach a child how to cook, how to pay taxes, how to interact socially with other people? Actually, yes, it is all of these things. And of course, I would never put my opponent in the position of arguing that we should limit parents from educating their children, because in essence, that is parenting, passing on what they know to their child. Of course, my opponent would never argue for something like that. Unfortunately, that is the point, that the position that they're taking, that homeschooling itself should be illegal. However, if we bring it down to an easier, then let's get rid of parenting. If we bring it down to an easier level, we can say my opponent actually is not arguing against homeschooling. They're arguing for forced public schooling or forced institutional schooling. They're arguing that children should be forced to go to school, and the parents should be punished if they don't. And they're arguing that and they're arguing in the burden of evidence they have to reach is that every school around the country is a better place, or that there are schools in districts where parents can send their children, that all of those around the country are better places than the parent could ever have homeschooling their child. And here's why. Because what does it mean to make something illegal? According to Yale law professor Stephen Carter, on the opening day of law school, I always counsel my first-year students never to support a law they are not willing to kill to enforce. How does this work? Even a civil violation such as speeding. If you speed, you get a civil violation. If you don't show up to court, they get a criminal warrant. If they come to serve the warrant and they come to arrest you and you resist, they have the legal authority to kill you. That is not the type of burden to be taken lightly. And that is a burden that my opponent would like to place on the parents of 1.7 million students, that is 3.4% of the school-age population, to ban homeschooling. Very quickly, my opponent presented anecdotal evidence that he had seen child abuse. That said, child abuse is already illegal, and there are plenty of ways to bring children outside the home, and plenty of examples of homeschool children going outside the home, outside public school, to prevent that type of thing. Thank you.
Oh, weird. Okay, cool. So anyways, first of all, I'm not saying a parent shouldn't teach a child. They should. I think that's great. In fact, I think it's necessary for the entire process for a child to grow up. I'm very specifically, as you pointed out, talking about the legal institution of homeschooling, which replaces institutional schooling. I also want to point out, children are already forced to get an education. That's already the legal truth in this country. We as a society have already decided that children should be lawfully required to have an education that meets institutional standards. So already, if we're saying, legal, illegal, that means carried by the force of death, then already we have decided that about children getting a minimum standard of education. And while there are parents who are doing a better job in the home than they would do in a public school, I think it's reasonable to expect those parents would still do a very good job, as good of a job teaching their children while the children was going to public school as a supplementary education. I also think that sometimes rules like this do drag down the best in order to provide a bottom for the worst. I think that the country as a whole is a better place when we can ensure that there aren't kids who are reaching 18 and suddenly aren't getting the education they need. I think that when we are setting these standards, I think that when we have already decided that this is going to be our legal, standard that a child gets a minimum level of education, if we're already going to make that decision, I think that making sure that that's actually happening by sending all these kids to school is important. And I think that while it's true that there are a lot of opportunities for homeschooling kids to be seen by the community, and while it's true that most homeschooling kids are seen by the community, it's also true that it is legally possible in this nation for someone to keep their child in the home all the time. It's possible in this nation for a parent to keep a child and abuse them and torture them and do whatever they want with them without any adult ever seeing them outside of the house. That is a legal possibility right now. And that's a problem for me. And I think, if I have 100 kids who are homeschooled and 95 come out just fine, go on to college and have a great life, but then 5, one is abused and the other 4 don't have that minimum standard of education by the time they hit 18, I think that's a problem. And if we could send all 100 in public schools and make sure that those kids are getting things under the assumption that these parents who are so involved enough in their lives to teach them all the time, the assumption that these parents would then continue to pour into their children while they're in public school, I think the idea those kids would not do just as well is ridiculous. There's a lot of studies that show that involved parents do influence the grades of kids in public school and in any schooling environment. I have 10 seconds left, so I'm just going to go ahead and pass the mic rather than forming some kind of conclusion, because I want to see what my opponent has to say.
Thank you again for that rebuttal and for the civil debate, which we have way too little of in our society. So in responding briefly to my opponent, he said that he's not saying a parent shouldn't teach a child, which again, I would argue definition of homeschooling is basically parenting. However, lowering us back down to the standard that is not the standard of this debate, but the standard of should kids be forced to go to public school instead of, it's not a legal institution of homeschooling, it's just homeschooling, just people teaching their kids. But nonetheless, and if we should force kids to go to public school, my opponent has said that, and first of all, to lay out the specific measure he has to reach to the point to say that it's okay to kill or to allow violence to be caused toward a parent of 3.4% of the population if he gets his way at homeschooling is made illegal. So that would require him saying it's better in just about everywhere that we have better public schools and parents should not even have the option to go anywhere else. In argument for that, he said that we've decided to force education on all children. That is true in most states in the United States, that education is required, whether homeschool or public. What we did decide as a society is it was good for children to be educated. What we did not decide as a society is that children should be forced through a particular method of education and not be allowed through any other method of education outside of institutional schooling. And that is essentially what my opponent is arguing. The third thing that my opponent says is that it's possible for parents to abuse their kids if they don't go to public school. It seems to be the crux of his argument. Well, if you Google, for some reason, on the internet, schools sued for abuse of children, you will see tons of results. Let me give you a few examples. According to the Vera Institute of Justice, and before I do that, a type of abuse is being put on the path to prison. And according to the Vera Institute for Justice, because of zero tolerance policies in public schools, 60% of students in one Texas study were suspended or expelled at one point in middle or high school. That for behaviors that did not fall within the perimeter of the state of Texas zero tolerance, including smoking tobacco, etc. And that pathway shows that a single suspension or expulsion that did not include a weapon almost tripled a student's likelihood of ending up in prison. This disproportionately affects students of color, as 3.5 times the Black students are more likely to be suspended. And thirdly, and back to my opponent's point, he said if 95% of homeschooled students are good and get a good education, et cetera, and 5% are not, that is unacceptable. Well, if 60% if more than half of students are.
So first of all, and I apologize for this, my audio cut out a little bit when you were talking about whatever you were saying regarding jail. So I'm sorry, but you might have to repeat that part in your next statement. And I know that's kind of an obnoxious thing, but whatever, my computer's stupid. So first of all, it's true that children will be abused either way. But one way it can be caught, it can be seen. We can see whether or not a child is being mistreated. Children in every walk of life are abused. Rich, poor, black, white, homeschooled, public schooled, atheist, religious. Kids of all walks of life are being abused. But the question is, can we find it? Can we fix it? Can we as a society have someone who sees these kids and who's like, that doesn't really, seem entirely right. You know what I mean? And furthermore, oh yeah. So it's not just they have to go to public school. They go to private school. All the homeschool parents come together and organize classes on their own. As long as the kid has some kind of a legal barrier between him and a life of total isolation, as long as it is legally impossible for that to happen, I'm good. And I'm talking, again, very specifically, anything that has to do with, a dad teaching his kid how to fix a car, or teaching their kid math after school. That stuff, I'm not arguing against that stuff. And so I don't know why it's been brought up in both of your turns. I think that stuff is wonderful. However, I think that we have to make sure, if we're going to make it legally required, we have to make sure that our children are in fact going to get the education that we've decided that they need. And I think that we aren't getting that if we're just letting parents take them out of school and do whatever they want with them and then testing them at 18 or testing them at the end of the year or whatever. So what do we do if they fail those tests? You know what I mean? Can we take them away then? Are we then saying that we're going to kill the parents? I think the hysteria around me wanting it to be illegal means that I want to slaughter 3.4% of the parents in America is honestly kind of a ridiculous statement. I have no interest in, obviously, it is true that all laws are backed by force, but I think that's a very hysterical reason not to make something illegal. I think we have a lot of ways of arresting somebody that doesn't kill them. I think that we could, I don't want to go through all the different ways of doing that, but I think that that's not going to be the case in almost any cases. I don't think there are going to be people dying in the streets because we made homeschooling illegal. I think we'll have people grumbling on Facebook and taking their kids to school. Yeah, if you can show me some evidence that 3.4% of parents are going to be wiped out, I'll consider that a real argument. But otherwise, I think that that's kind of dumb. Yeah, and sorry that I need you to repeat that other thing about the jail thing.
It is somewhat concerning. Thank you for that response. It is somewhat concerning that my opponent would argue that he's going to start being concerned about force being used on parents of children who, again, we've never shown have done anything wrong. He's going to start worrying about that when it actually comes down to them being killed. I find that to be a pretty low threshold of tolerance, honestly. That the concern should not just be with potential violence, which is what I said, but also with the fines, punishments, with penalties of people who there's no argument, there's no due process that has shown that these people have done anything wrong. And I find that to just not be a good standard for society. My opponent has said that if we need to be able to see the abuse, that seems to be his primary argument. First of all, I'd like him to present statistics that show that homeschool children are abused. But secondly, that how much homeschool children are abused and what percentage of the abuse is there. But secondly, if you see the abuse but don't address it, as teachers are institutionally protected by the schools, and the schools have a financial interest to protect those teachers from allegations of abuse, as proven in case after case after case, then it doesn't matter whether you see it or not. If you don't address it, that's not the point. The kid needs a legal barrier against isolation is a completely different argument of whether or not the kid should be homeschooled. Homeschooling provides no requirement for the kid to stay in the home, and homeschooling does not protect the kid from any type of arguments or warrants that the police would serve on child abuse or anything like that. It's just an absurd argument. My opponent brought up a really important point that I think is well worth this discussion, because it actually tusses out the reason we have public school or education in the first place. Is he said, get the education that they need. And the burden of proof is now actually on my opponent to show that public education actually gets kids the education they need. Does it get kids into a job when, even through the college system that you're looking at, not just public education, but private education, institutional education generally, does it get kids into, out of college, only a third of graduates are actually going to get the job that they want. We're sending kids to prison through school. The school prison pipeline is well known. So give me some statistics and some factors that show that the public school system is doing such a good job that we should fine parents if they don't send their kids there. And that is the burden, quite frankly, that my opponent has to meet in arguing for forced public schooling, whether it's fines, whether it's direct punishment, or whether it's jail or worse.
Howdy. So first of all, I want to point out that when we were talking about the potential of abuse, you told me that I needed statistics, I needed all these all these important things that I agree are important. But I was just pointing out that the institution leaves these loopholes that allows for children to be abused. But when we're talking about parents suddenly being murdered in the streets because homeschooling is illegal, then we can just talk about potential. We suddenly don't need statistics anymore. And I think that's kind of ridiculous. I think that the potential for abuse in an environment where the parent can totally isolate the child from society is a lot greater than the potential for 3.4% of parents to be marched to the concentration camps or whatever it is you're arguing is going to happen. I think that if we can talk about potential, when we say, well, by saying it's illegal, you're saying that we can slaughter all these parents. I think that if you could talk about that, then I could talk about the potential involved in allowing a parent to totally isolate a child from society. I also think while we could have other systems, the modern institution of homeschooling, homeschooling as it exists in this country, the homeschooling that I am attacking, allows, but does not require, but allows for the isolation of the child. I think that should be illegal. It's a really big issue that this could happen, and I think that that should be illegal. And we could replace it with some other system. We could send them all to existing systems. I don't really care what we do, as long as we change the current system such that it is no longer a legal option for you to isolate your child. I also think that while the public schools don't necessarily do a good job in terms of some measurements that we could lay down on them in terms of long-term success and all these things, what they do represent is the government's understanding of what a minimum education requires. And that is, we the people voted for these representatives and they set the standard bar for what education is. Maybe that bar is wrong and maybe that bar needs to be adjusted. But the public schools represent, if we have decided as a society to make that the bar and to push kids toward that bar, the public schools at the very least represent the government's understanding of what that bar is. And if that's wrong, we can talk about that. We can have another debate about what that should look like and whether or not it's right or wrong and whether or not it's having a good impact. But I think at the end of the day, there are these standardized tests and these things that these kids are being pushed through in order to get into college, in order to get into life. And it is, again, possible, and there is potential for a parent to fall short of those standards without any accountability. And when that happens, if that happens, the kid gets the short end of the stick. And I think that there's a lot of room in homeschooling for people to succeed, but I think that it is better that we have a higher minimum than that we have the people who soar continue to do so. I think it's important that everybody gets that minimum standard. More important than that the people who do succeed more.
Thank you again for that. So I want to address a couple things. One is this constant going back to concentration camps and murder, as my opponent is actually being quite ridiculous. The statement that I read off from the Yale law professor showed that it had the potential for violence. And actually, when he uses, I'm talking about potential for violence or potential for fines and punishments and things like that, not potential for violence. When he uses that as, okay, well, now I don't need statistics for my argument. The potential is for violence. The guarantee is for fines and punishments. if my opponent can come up with a way to enforce a law without actually having any enforcement behind it, I am really interested to hear this model because it would be new and transform society. However, as our current model, it is guaranteed that any parent that does not follow that law when homeschooling is made illegal will be fined, will be punished, will be sanctioned in some way, or the law will be ineffective. And that goes to enforcement of the law. So that's not potential, that's actuality. Secondly, my opponent believes that homeschooling allows for the isolation of a child. Lots of things allow for the isolation of a child far outside of homeschooling. When a child is brought to a institutional school in Amish territory, where everyone knows each other and it's all community, that's exactly where in massively religious institutions, that's exactly where a lot of child abuse happens. Also, isolation it includes physical isolation, but again, going back to the point, if you don't address it, it doesn't matter whether or not it's out there. And arguing that because a certain system might isolate someone, isolate a child, isolate a person, a certain system might have some impact on some of those people as a reason to make the whole system illegal is a very incredibly weak argument. In fact, I could make the same argument back to him where he says, oh, the government has an understanding and we have standards and we're pushing toward those standards. I can make the same argument. Well, then you just improve homeschooling to institute monitors or institute standards that already exist in law for child abuse, but some sort of way to fix that. That's not an argument for making the system illegal. And finally, this is really important. What matters is not the government's intent. It is not the government's understanding. It is not institutional understanding or beliefs as a society. That's not what matters. What matters is the actual results that are produced out of this system. And frankly, until my opponent can show that there is significantly less child abuse in the public school system than in the homeschooling system, he had a right to argue that parents should be punished.
Okay, cool. So first of all, you said the potential is for violence, the guarantee is for fines and punishments. I'm totally okay with fines and punishments. Fines and punishments are great. You were talking about killing. You were talking about 3.4% of American parents being, killed on the shooting range, whatever you're talking about. Like, that's ridiculous. But, enforcement of the law, that's great. And I view your backtracking to some kind of enforcement as actual consequences as kind of, again, backtracking. Like, that's wonderful. You know what I mean? I hope that there is all kinds of fines and punishments involved in the enforcement of this law and every other law that I've ever supported. Okay with that. Now, I'm not okay with, 3.4% of American parents being gunned down in the streets, but I also think that that's not going to happen, and also certainly not something that I support. However, you said that homeschooling allows for the isolation of a child, but there's also other situations that allow for the isolation of a child. And I think if every child was in a school and they were required to have some oversight, I think that would be, better than total isolation. And I think that Amish communities and these small communities, little towns in nowhere, Texas, all this stuff, right, are isolated, but not isolated in the same way as I can keep my child in the basement and not feed them for 18 years and no one could ever know. I think that those things are really, really different. And I think that that while there is certainly room for overlooking issues among friends, among tight-knit or small communities, I think that potential is greatly lesser. I think the more adult eyes on a child, the more likely it is that one of those eyes will notice if the child is being mistreated. And I think that it is similar, but to such a lesser extent that I can draw that line. I think I could say, no to isolation in the home, but it's okay to isolate within the religious communities because I'm not going to ask everyone to move to, New York City, right? That'd be silly. So I think that really the issue here is we have to decide whether it is more important that some children be able to, I think that there are kids in homeschooling who do better in homeschooling than they would in public schooling. I think that public schooling will hurt some kids. I think that it'll drag down their top. But I think those kids will still do great. I think that those kids will still have parents who really care about their education. I think they'll still get the education they need in these other schools. And what that does is, although it drags down the top, it also pushes up the bottom. It prevents us from having the potential for these horrible behaviors. And unfortunately, there aren't as many studies. In fact, there are no studies that I know of on this subject of any kind. And I did do Googling before this. But the potential exists, and that's a problem. And I think that we should fix that problem.
For those of us who are old enough to remember Y2K, there was a time in the United States where the computers were going to hit their limit and they're going to shut down. According to who you, depending on who you listen to, planes would crash, grocery stores would stop providing groceries. All of these things, I mean, the whole system would completely collapse. The United States government spent billions of dollars preparing for Y2K. Governments around the world, the markets were supposed to crash. It was supposed to collapse. It was a calamity, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those things, if they were true, would have been terrible. But my opponent is presenting an argument that for protecting kids from isolation without actually showing any real numbers or real proof that isolation is a major problem inside the homeschooling community, and that isolation has those deleterious effects on those kids enough that we should make homeschooling illegal because of it. He really hasn't presented any statistics. That is a huge problem among kids in those communities. So we're dealing my opponent is making an argument that we should shut down the education. And in fact, he quite clearly said that there are kids who will do better homeschool. So my opponent is actually willing to tell those kids and their parents that you will do worse. I'm not particularly concerned as much about your outcomes. That it's okay that you do worse, that it's okay that your kid, who just, by accident of birth is better homeschooled than anywhere else, that your kid actually is disadvantaged in society. That's okay because of a problem that we don't actually know is a major problem, and that there's no statistics or numbers that exist. I find that to be a really problematic argument. And so to close, you can review the tape. I never once backtracked. My position has always been as the potential for violence, as the Yale law professor put it, and fines, punishments, penalties are all involved with that. And the violence goes up to and including killing. Eric Garner was killed for selling Lucy's. That's not exactly the law people expected people to be killed over. But nonetheless, again, fines, punishments, penalties all the way through. Secondly, my opponent has to show that the isolation that he's talking about is an actual problem in the homeschooling community, and that it's a problem big enough to tell a generation of kids that the education that could have raised you up and could have made you better, that you're not going to get that education, and that's okay because of a non-existent problem. And I find that to be a really not correct position. Thank you so much for debating me on Call Out.
3.4% of parents, as you say, homeschool their kids. And as I suggested, that, and there's 300 million people in America. And so there will be some kids who would benefit from the homeschooling system. That doesn't mean a whole generation of children is suddenly, being disadvantaged in this horrible way, because there are some kids who are doing better, and there are some kids who are doing worse in the homeschooling system. And that just makes sense, right? But my issue is not that I have, there's like millions of these kids we can prove are being mistreated. We have found cases of abuse in homeschooling environments, but I'm more concerned with the fact that it is legally possible for a parent to isolate a child. It has happened. There are cases that you can find online. I can spam some in the comment section if you like. It has happened. Oh, there aren't firm statistics because no one has done the research yet. But if it is possible, that is a hole in our legal system. That's a hole in our education system. It shouldn't be possible. And I also want to go ahead and say that any law, if you break the law, if we make a law and you break it and you resist arrest, you will be the victim of violence. And I don't think that's bad either. I think that that's totally okay. And I think that, don't break the law and resist arrest. Yeah. And, my issue is this. We need to. These children they are not the property of their parents. They are the next generation of our society. They're our future. We need to make sure that they are getting a minimum standard of education that we can observe and that we as a community can vote on. We need to make sure that these parents, there are still 97% of parents whose kids are in the regular schools, and those parents, need. Man, I lost my train of thought because I only have 20 seconds left. All right, you know what? Conclusionary statement. I'm right. Vote for me. He's wrong. Bam.